We've all had it happen. Is it the murder scheme in CK3 that fails again and again regardless of the maximum 95% chance? Or is it the 49% siege in EO4 or EO5 that fails over and over and over again? And not even to talk about the countless events that can undermine a player's strategy entirely. For example, if your golden heir dies on a hunting accident. And then you say to yourself, I thought I was playing a strategy game here, not Monopoly. Monopoly isn't a strategy game, right? Anyways, there are also very famous strategy games that don't use RNG in their main game mechanics. Total War, Anno, Age of Empires. A lot of these strategy games work very well without a random number generator behind each corner. So let's talk about it. What makes strategy games truly strategy? So first of all, we need to talk about what is strategy. The general term strategy comes from the Greek term strategia, which basically means troop leadership, office in general, or commanding. Nowadays, Wikipedia defines strategy as a general plan to achieve one or more long-term or overall goals under conditions of uncertainty. If we go from that definition of this term strategy, then that basically means two things, okay? First of all, if you know exactly what will happen beforehand and then make a plan to counter that, then it's not strategy because you already knew what happened. There was no uncertainty whatsoever. And the other thing is, if it's not long term, for example, if you plan to go for the kebab place next door for dinner, that's not strategy, okay? It's not strategy because it's not long term and it's also not overall in terms of the goal that you set yourself. And if we get back to the strategy games now, then that basically means that we have to have a closer look on those two definitions of strategy and how they are implemented into strategy games, into different strategy games, because there are definitely different approaches to these. So let's start with the long-term plans in strategy games. To talk about this long-term plan thing in video games, you actually have to think about one question, which is, can you plan reliable strategies for long-term goals in a strategy game without being limited by RNG? We get to the uncertainty part in a second. But first of all, if you plan something long-term, a long-term strategy, for example, in CK3 that you want to become the HRE Emperor sometime, right? You don't say it's a plan for this character that I'm playing right now, but you say it's a long-term goal. Then that could be the first part of the strategy. But if then a second later the HRE collapses entirely by an RNG event that you didn't influence it anyway, then this RNG basically destroyed your entire ability to make a long-term strategy for the HRE in this case, right? So therefore, already if that happened, the RNG was so high that it wouldn't even be possible to plan a reliable strategy long-term. Okay, it doesn't mean that you know that you always have to achieve your plan. You can always fail, maybe because I don't know, some other guys always get elected over and over again and you never manage to do so. But if an RNG factor destroys your entire strategy from the beginning of the game, basically, then it's not really a strategy game in my opinion. And then you're going to notice that this is not necessary for a strategy game. So there are also some like very, very small RNG events in Rome Total War. But basically the strategy in Rome Total War is relying not on the fact of a changing world, but on a fact of a counter strategy to counter other AI tactics, for example, okay? So if you play whatever, like Carthage or something, you want to defeat Rome, and then what you do is you can make a strategy to counter the Roman units, which, you know, you don't know what exactly the AI will build in their armies, but you know in general they will have a lot of good infantry, they will have a bad cavalry potentially and bad skirmishers or no ranged weaponry really, and therefore then you can have a long-term strategy of researching the right technologies to then eventually build up an army that can counter the heavy infantry focus with probably maybe, you know, better slingers or better ranged weapons. And the difference to Crusader Kings or Europa Universalis is basically that you don't have the changing world while you're trying to execute your plan or your strategy. So you have a world that of course someone can conquer some city or something, but there is no such great RNG events that can change the world entirely, for example dissolving the HRE. So what I want to say with that is that there are actually differences in executing that long-term plans part in strategy games, because you can execute that with long-term plans or long-term strategy that you use then RNG to make the player struggle with it a little, so that the player has to have a plan B or plan C, or you make the general strategy more easy to achieve, but then of course more rewarding for the player, right? So if you have a strategy in mind and then you execute that over several rounds in Rome Total War, and then in the end you have the final army, you march towards Rome and you conquer Rome, then that is of course the perfect example of a well executed strategy that you planned long term, okay? Whereas in, as I said, grand strategy games from Paradox, you always have the problem that you can't really be sure that your strategy will work out. But anyways, let me know what you think about that in the comments, because now we get to the really interesting second part of the strategy definition, which is uncertainty. Now the general question over here is if luck equals uncertainty. The general idea of, for example, these RNG events that I talked about, or the, you know, RNG factors in the schemes, murder schemes, for example, or something in CK3, the idea behind all of these RNG numbers is that if you have a lot of randomness in your world, that means that the player physically can't know what's going to happen next. Of course, luck means uncertainty because it changes the variables consistent enough to never have a predictable situation. But the big question, the big but for this is, first of all, is that realistic? Now, of course, it could happen that for some reason a 95% chance murder scheme, in that case, you know, it is a very slim chance that somehow the plot fails. If a medieval ruler tried something like that, of course there is always a slim chance that it fails, okay? But the thing is that this doesn't have to be resolved with a random number, basically, because what you could also do is you could make hidden modifiers, for example, for the defending character. So for example, if you had a character, so whatever, a king, the king of France or something, had a taster for himself that tasted his food so that he can be sure that it's not poisoned, right? Now obviously the emperor of the HRE, let's say, who tried to get a murder scheme on the king of France, he wouldn't necessarily need to know that. Okay, so what you could do as a game mechanic instead is that you have a murder scheme set up for the player. Let's say the player is the HRE emperor. murder scheme setup where the player can choose between either I want to, either I want to let the mob finish the action, or I want to poison the food, or I want to, I don't know, let him have a hunting accident, right? And then the player chooses one of those three options based on the things that he knows, which is, for example, that he knows, yeah, I mean, I've got a good, I've got a very well built poison that immediately, that immediately gets the job done and so on. And then he chooses that option, which is basically then the idea of setting up a murder scheme that ends up with poisoning food. Okay? And the uncertainty behind that would be that the player doesn't know that the AI King of France actually has a taster on him, which actually removes the chance of being poisoned at all, okay? Because he has a taster doing that for them. On the other hand, that means if the player had chosen a hunting accident, for example, that could have been an easy 100% success because the King of France maybe had a taster, but no one that is actually helping him during the hunt or something, right? So that is basically the idea of uncertainty that is not luck-based, and that gets the job done, in my opinion, even better because it's way more realistic if we get back to the realism point in that. So you can have uncertainty that is realistic without random number generators. And the other question that I have for luck as the only uncertainty factor is if chaos is truly a strategic ladder. Now, we all know chaos is a ladder from Game of Thrones and all that, which is a great line, by the way, and it really fits the strategy of Littlefinger a lot in the show, right? But the question is, for strategy games, is chaos actually helpful for the idea of creating strategies? Now we actually get back to combining uncertainty and the long-term plan thing. Chaos creates uncertainty, yes, but on the other hand, it basically destroys the long-term plans. And what I mean, as an example, in EU5, for example, let's say you have a crazy idea of playing whatever, like the of playing the HRE Emperor and becoming the Emperor of China as well. That is a great example for a long-term strategy, in my opinion. Okay, so you don't plan every detail. You don't plan exactly how to get to East Asia. You don't plan exactly how to overtake whoever is emperor at the time and so on. You just plan the overall goal, the strategy of becoming emperor of China, and then combining those two emperorships. And now, what an excessive use of luck and RNG basically creates is a chaos where you can't even be sure that the Emperor of China, the mandate of heaven, is even existing anymore when you get to East Asia. Okay, so it could be gone entirely. They could be conquered. They could be, blown up by events. And then you reach East Asia, try to execute your strategy and become Emperor of China. And the chaos destroyed the general objective of your entire strategy. And that is basically why I would say that luck is a very, very dangerous idea to implement in a strategy game. If used correctly, then luck can create chaos at the right stages of the game to actually make the strategy more interesting, yes. But if there is an excessive use of RNG, like for example in the CK3, every single event has a random number generator. For example, whatever you're hunting something, there is always a 4% chance that your character dies. Like, this is the term of excessive use of RNG that is neither realistic nor is it actually helpful for long-term strategies and also not for uncertainty. Because what is the uncertainty of a 4% chance of dying? If you actually see, that's the extreme example in CK3, if you even see what the exact chances are, there is no uncertainty for the player, and therefore it's not strategy at all, it is simply a casino. And I have to say, this is why I really like games like Rome Total War, for example, Anno, for example, that have basically no randomness involved in core game mechanics at all, so that actually your strategy has the feeling of a strategy being evolved slowly and slowly, step by step, which you can't really do in these grand strategy games, worst of all Crusader Kings, because of the excessive use of luck and RNG in every single mechanic of the game. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed the podcast basically of me talking about RNG and luck in video games. Definitely let me know in the comments what you think about this strategy luck idea. But anyways, we are going to see as always on another Monday.